After the breakout success of her debut novel, The Tattooist of Auschwitz, author Heather Morris didn't wait long to write a follow-up to her historical fiction novel based on the life of a survivor named Lali Sokolov. Just a year later, she published Cilka's Journey, a sequel about one of the first book's side characters, Cilka Klein. As the cover tells us, the novel is based on the heartbreaking true story where her beauty saved her life and condemned her. Cilka's fate was one of the biggest loose threads in the end of The Tattooist. Heather Morris says she received letters from readers all around the world asking what happened to her. She herself felt a strong connection with Cilka's story. Lali had described Cilka as one of the bravest people he knew and someone who had saved his life, and he urged Heather Morris to write his story after telling his. And so, of course, Heather simply had to do it. In the novel, Cilka is only 16 when she arrives at Auschwitz-Birkenau. There, she's forced into the role of block leader while suffering terrible abuse from 2 camp officers. But even after the camp's liberation, the nightmare doesn't end there. Accused of collaboration, Cilka is sentenced to 15 years hard labour in a Siberian gulag. Yet somehow this story isn't as bleak as it sounds, because through the sheer goodness of her heart, she survives the gulag, meets the love of her life, and marries him after finally finding her freedom. Or at least that's the version of the story that Heather Morris tells us. Because it didn't take long for the criticism to roll in. Cilka was already one of the most contested characters in The Tattooist, so writing a whole book about her was clearly going to be controversial. What Heather Morris and her publishers probably didn't expect, however, was for the real Cilka Klein's living relatives to find the book so offensive that they threatened her with lawyers. According to the family, the Cilka in the novel is nothing like the woman they knew. Now, as much as we tore apart The Tattooist, it is at least possible to piece together where the information came from. Lali and Gita's testimonies roughly align with the broad shape of the plot. Heather Morris claims she did similar extensive research with Cilka's Journey. So what went wrong? How did Cilka's Journey end up so far away from the truth? If you need a quick refresher, here is a quick recap of the first book and why it sparked so much debate. The Tattooist of Auschwitz tells the story of Lali Sokolov, a Slovakian Jew who was forced to work as a tattooist, marking identification numbers on other prisoners' arms. In his 90s, Lali decided he wanted a writer to tell his story. That person ended up being Heather Morris, and the resulting novel became a global bestseller. But as the novel's success grew, historians raised concerns. Critics pointed out historical inaccuracies, implausible scenarios, and the way the novel overfocuses on the romance plot. The Memorial Museum even published detailed breakdowns of the book and its TV adaptation, listing all the historical inaccuracies, errors, and distortions. Despite this, the book continued to be widely popular and it left fans wanting more. This catapulted the success of other popular fiction titles, and we can see the emergence of a whole Auschwitz genre of sentimental novels with mass appeal but little connection to the historical documentation. It's best summed up by one literary scholar and survivor who observed back in 2001, before Lali and Heather had even met, that Holocaust literature had already become a kind of commercial product. Now, before we continue, just a heads up, this video deals with some very heavy topics. If you read either of the books, you'll probably have a sense of what's coming. But if not, please be aware that in addition to the atrocities committed in the camp, we'll also be discussing gender-based violence and how it's represented, or rather misrepresented, in the novels. This won't come up until later in the video where I'll give another heads up, but if that's something you're rather not engaged with, feel free to click away. As we've seen, Cilka's Journey claims to be based on a true story, but who was the real Cilka and where did Heather Morris get her information from? The novel begins roughly where The Tattooist left off, liberation of the camps. It follows the story of Cilka Klein, a young Slovakian Jewish woman as she's arrested by the Soviets and sentenced to 15 years hard labour at a Siberian gulag for allegedly collaborating with the enemy. The tragedy, as Heather Morris sees it, is of a young girl who suffers abuse at the hands of the officers, only just as she thinks she may finally be free, for her to be blamed for her own abuse and punished harshly for it. Once again, she boards a squalid train bound for a brutal camp where she makes some friends, makes some enemies, becomes a camp wife to a male inmate, and eventually becomes a nurse in the maternity unit. Unlike with Lali's story, Heather Morris couldn't speak to Cilka herself, who had died in 2004, years before Heather began writing. Cilka spent much of her post-camp, post-gulag life in Slovakia with her husband. Meanwhile, Heather Morris lived on the other side of the world in New Zealand and Australia, and so only later learned about Cilka through other people's memories. She had a historian research the Gulag where Cilka was sent, and she visited Cilka's hometown in Slovakia to consult the local records. At this point, Heather Morris felt confident that she had all the information she needed to write Cilka's story. Throughout the novel, we get flashbacks to Cilka's time at Auschwitz that reveal why she acted the way she did and how this experience informed her later choices. Heather Morris's portrayal of Cilka aligns with Lali's recollections of her. She was the bravest person he ever knew and someone who saved his life and others, even though tragically no one could save her in return. As we are told in The Tattooist and Cilka's journey, Cilka was a young woman whose good looks granted her a marginally more secure position as a block leader, and she was allowed to keep her hair. However, this meant she attracted the attention of two officers who abused her. Yet despite these tragic events, Heather Morris presents her as a kind-hearted, loyal and brave girl, someone who became friends with Gita and saved Lali's life by bargaining with her abusers. Heather Morris felt a powerful connection with Cilka's story, and that inspired her to write her second book about her. She set about researching Cilka's life. If we remember from the last video, Heather Morris had a personal rule when writing The Tattooist. She would only ever include something that Lali spoke about if it could be corroborated by an all-important second piece of evidence. Here she hit an immediate problem. Lali only had limited interactions with Cilka, who was no longer alive to fill in the gaps for him. And neither was Gita, who had been friends with her. Lali himself had also passed away by the time the book went into development. Clearly, some new research methods were needed. Luckily for us, Heather Morris has written another book called Stories of Hope, which is all about her writing process, her friendship with Lali, and crucially for our purposes, how she listens to testimonies for her writing. It's rare for historical fiction writers to outline their process, so this book sounds like a dream. Except it's mostly about Heather Morris's parenting advice. I wish I was kidding. After a few familiar anecdotes about getting to know Lali, there is a long monologue about her childhood and why she decided to raise her children differently to the way her mother raised her. We learn about her grandson's special interests and sit through a long digression about her daughter's burnout while taking care of her newborn. And at the very end, we finally get a glimpse of the writing process behind Cilka's journey, or how she listens to history, as she puts it. Except this section is only about 15 pages long. Not to worry though, Heather told her fans it would be obvious which parts of the story were factual just by reading the book. So what research did she actually do? Well, first back when she was still working on that tattooist, she spoke to one of Lali's friends who grew up in the same town as Cilka. His version of events immediately complicated Lali's idealized view of her. He was the first person who said to me that Cilka did bad things. She was, however, kind to him, and he credits her with saving his life. Next, Heather asked Lali and Gita's other friends about Cilka, but the story just grew even more complicated. I heard contradictory stories. Cilka was a terrible girl, countered with she was so young, so brave. She helped so many people with extra food and clothing, using her position as a protected prisoner. But Heather was committed to telling Cilka's story after her promise to Lali. So she began searching the recorded testimonies to find references to Cilka, starting with Gita's, who gives a more empathetic account. Everyone says she was this and she was that, but she only had to do what the SS told her. If Mengele told her this person had to go to Block 25, she would take her in, She couldn't cope with so many people, but these people don't understand who haven't been there the whole time. To survive from 1942 to 1945 was extremely rare. Many who did, like Lali, Gita and Cilka, held roles that offered some protection from the harsh physical conditions. Lali was a tattooer, Gita sorted through belongings, and Cilka was the leader of Block 25, where the most ill and weak women were kept before being taken to the gas chambers. There was often a stigma attached to these roles, but more recently there's greater awareness that these prisoners were simply trying to survive. Heather Morris takes this more sympathetic view, and she clearly has a deep empathy for all three, particularly for what she sees as a grave injustice of Cilka's second imprisonment. She describes her emotional journey of visiting Cilka's hometown and viewing the records about her. Many researchers will relate to the feeling of connection as you uncover new details about the past. What's interesting is that she describes this as listening to history. She also spoke about how she listened to Lali without the use of recordings or other interview techniques. Undistracted learning is very important to her. And here again she is speaking about listening to silent archive records in the same way. The thing is, the records she found were very meaningful to her, but they are unfortunately not very relevant to the story she wanted to tell. She discovered school reports showing that Cilka was a good student, and she found that in 1958, Cilka updated her birth certificate to include her Czechoslovakian citizenship. She also uncovered details about her family, that her father's first wife, the mother of her eldest sister, died in childbirth, and he later remarried her sister, with whom he had Cilka. These were exciting discoveries for Morris, but most of them didn't make it into the book. In fact, Cilka's sisters are combined into one character, Magda. Meanwhile, more relevant information, such as what happened to Cilka's mother, remains unknown. To fill the remaining gaps, Morris turned to the professionals. A historian was hired to examine the Gulag records, though it's not clear what exactly she found or how it shaped the story. More clear is the book's historical afterword by British historian Owen Matthews outlining the Gulag's history and conditions. This is where Heather Morris seems to have drawn most of her inspiration. She knew Cilka had worked as a nurse in the Gulag, and she seems to connect with women's history and their experiences of trauma. So it's not surprising she zooms in on the maternity unit and the difficulties facing women in the Gulag, weaving these themes throughout the novel. What's important to remember though is that almost all of the events described in Cilka's journey are fictional. Unlike The Tattooist, which was shaped by Lali's real testimony, Cilka's journey is essentially a new story informed by research, but largely imagined by Heather Morris. And that's fine for most historical fiction novels, but Cilka's journey has the tagline based on the heartbreaking true story. Heather Morris and her publishing team have marketed all her books as being heavily informed by extensive historical research. They claim the books are essentially novelizations of true memories, where all the plot points are based on real events. And while we can point to where many things in Tattooist fell short, it is indeed based on Lali's own testimony as he relayed it to Heather Morris. Cilka's journey, not so much. Heather Morris clearly respects Lali's opinion of Cilka as a good and brave soul who went through terrible abuse. How could she reconcile this positive interpretation with the more troubling accounts from others? And this, I'm afraid to say, is where it all starts to fall apart. Heather Morris may have listened to Lali, the testimonies, the archive records, and historical researchers, but the people she did not listen to were Cilka's living relatives. And when Cilka's stepson finally heard about the premise of the book, he had some major concerns. But by this point, the book was already deep into development, and there was nothing anyone could do to change Heather's understanding of Cilka and her journey. Immediately after publication, Cilka's journey was hit by significant and concerning criticism. Around the same time, the Memorial Museum released its article fact-checking the Tattooist of Auschwitz, which it described the character of Cilka as one of the more questionable parts of the novel. And although they haven't published a fact-checking article about any of Heather Morris's other books, I think we can safely assume that they would not be impressed by an entire novel expanding on what they consider to be one of the most unlikely side plots. According to their own research, it seems highly improbable that Cilka would have experienced ongoing abuse of this nature because of the strict punishments imposed at the time. The criticism didn't stop there. One historian has described it as a sex story that has very little historical accuracy. Another academic called out fictional Gita's description that Cilka is the plaything and said, given Gita's eloquent manner and insightful and sensitive descriptions in her testimony, this phrase appears to be quite incongruous. Even before the book was published, a journalist who had interviewed the real Cilka Klein contacted Heather Morris to warn her. He believed she didn't have the full picture of Cilka's life, and he didn't think it was a good idea to go ahead with the story. But the most concerning criticism of all came from Cilka's family. Lali's son Gary had written the afterword for The Tattooist, and he'd provided some family photos to print in the book. Heather Morris was keen for something similar from Cilka's living family members, so she visited them at their home in California, where she read aloud the manuscript for them. Unfortunately, this is where things went very wrong. In the novel, Cilka meets her future husband in the Gulag, and after their release they build a new life together. Although they never had children together, she forms a strong bond with her new stepson, George. But Heather Morris's description of George's father was completely unrecognisable to him. As a quick fix, the publishers changed his name and added a note saying he was a fictional character. But George suspected this was entirely motivated by the publishers' desire to protect themselves from legal repercussions. And besides, what he wanted was the truth, not privacy. Things only got worse from here. The more George read, the more fictional Cilka felt like a stranger to the stepmother he knew. He was especially upset by the scene where she steals drugs from the Gulag hospital because she'd always had a reputation for honesty, and he took serious offence to the claims that she was involved with two commanders, which is the plot point that underpins the whole book. Heather Morris left the disastrous meeting without her family photos or her afterword, and instead with a serious letter from George's lawyers saying he wanted nothing to do with the book and he would instead like a full apology. But Heather Morris was already steamrolling ahead with her novel. The response was that George's concerns meant very little, since he was not a biological relative, and in any case, the book was based on extensive research and everything in it had been 100% verified. Now, this may be a familiar rhetoric because it's exactly the same kind of deflection Heather Morris and her publishers would use when The Tattooist was criticised for historical inaccuracy. The difference this time, however, is that Heather Morris couldn't speak to Cilka or listen to her testimony. She may have referred to archive records or databases, but by necessity, Cilka's journey was never going to be as historically informed as the Tattooist. The historical evidence simply is not there, or at least there isn't enough to support the kind of story she wanted to tell. She says in the author's note that, although it weaves together facts and reportage from the experiences of women sent to the Soviet Gulag system at the end of the Second World War, it is a novel and does not represent the entire facts of Cilka's life. This didn't stop Cilka's family finding the book so grievous that George and his wife Julia wrote their own version. Love and Redemption is basically the same premise as Cilka's journey, a fictionalization of her life, except this time it was written from the perspective of her stepson. So they obviously don't have a problem with fictionalizing the past, just with how Heather Morris chose how to do it. The book claims to be directly informed by conversations with the real Cilka, which is likely to be true, and it has some previously unseen pictures and documents, but largely it really does just seem like it exists to prove a point rather than to say anything meaningful about history. Meanwhile, the publishers did the usual about how it's a novel and not a piece of non-fiction. The problem is, the illusion of authenticity was what made the Tattooist sell so well, and the publishers lean into that when it's convenient, only to distance themselves when it's challenged. Cilka's journey inherits the same authorial authority as part of Heather Morris's brand. I fully believe that many readers assume she'd done the same kind of immersive first-hand research she often so describes in her interviews about the Tattooist, but that simply isn't the case. Without access to Cilka's own voice, most of the Gulag plot is a combination of other people's stories or otherwise completely fabricated. Not only that, but Heather Morris went into the book with a preconceived idea of how she wanted to portray Cilka, and she didn't let contradictory evidence get in the way of that endeavour. At best, Cilka's journey is a reimagining of the experiences of someone a bit like Cilka Klein, informed by Lali's memories. If the book didn't have her name on the cover, and if it didn't claim to be telling the true story of a specific individual, this might be fine, but it does. It specifically pinpoints Cilka Klein as its inspiration and then runs away imagining what might have happened to her. And this is where I thought the video might end, with the idea that Cilka's journey is not nearly as historically informed as Heather Morris might have readers believe. But then I looked again at the concerns raised by Cilka's stepson. At first, I just felt bad for the guy and the emotional roller coaster Heather Morris put him through. First, fury at the allegations. Second is confusion about how little the fictional Cilka resembled the woman he knew. And finally, something more complex. Because the more he learned about the testimonies connected to Cilka, the more he began to wonder whether there was a side of her he'd never known. Because Heather Morris did find testimony suggesting there were rumours about Cilka receiving the commandant. And there are also survivor accounts describing her committing violent acts. The fictional Cilka doesn't line up with the witness accounts about Cilka Klein. In fact, the differences are so stark that at times it feels like we're talking about two completely different people. And that's when I started to wonder, what if that's exactly what happened? What if Heather Morris confused Cilka Klein with someone else? Let's start by reminding ourselves what Heather Morris seems to think she knows about the real Cilka Klein. Allegedly, Cilka was so beautiful that she was the only inmate in the camp allowed to keep her hair. She was made leader of Block 25, the hut where women were held before being sent to the gas chambers. She was close to Gita, and according to Heather Morris, her privileged position helped her save Lali's life. But she also experienced repeated abuse from the SS officers who allegedly took her as her personal plaything. Heather Morris claims she based this version of Cilka on Lali's memories, Gita's testimony, recollections from their friends, and archive research from Cilka's hometown. Now, I can't travel to Cilka's hometown and I can't speak to Lali or his friends, but I can try to piece together where these claims came from, or try to, because in all the discussion about Cilka's journey, no one bothers to say where they got the information from. Like, would it hurt these authors and journalists to include archive references or interview codes? So now, instead, I have to try and reverse engineer their research to figure out if their claims are legitimate or if they're just talking out their behinds. Anyway, rant over. Sorry about that. Here's what we do know. Cilka Klein is listed on the Visual History Archive as a Jewish capo, which they define as SS-appointed Jewish prisoners responsible for overseeing labour squads and for carrying out various duties in the camp. One testimony recalls, "I found out that the women's camp elder was a girl by the name of Cilka Klein. She was an absolute murderer. She has probably more blood on her hands than anyone else. But even she sent food to me, sent clothing to me, inquired about my well-being, so it's very difficult to explain how some people react sometimes." We get a complex image here. Cilka is remembered as someone with a nasty streak, or at least she did in this extreme environment, but she also showed kindness to someone from her hometown. This nuanced view also comes through in Gita's testimony. She doesn't mention Cilka by name, but she says she later went to visit her in Slovakia where Cilka settled, so we can safely put two and two together here. Gita references the harsh opinions of Cilka and defends what she did by stating that she didn't have much of a choice. And she definitely had a lot to defend against. The descriptions from witnesses are deeply troubling. She was very cruel. She was repulsive. Cilka often did not give food to prisoners on the block, but sold or exchanged them for her own benefit. Cilka raged unrestrained against her companions in misfortune, the notorious example of Seely. Her arrogance, heart of a criminal. Suddenly, it starts to become a lot clearer why Cilka was charged with collaboration and sent to a gulag. Today, there's a stronger understanding that Kappas were victims, and that's led to a more sympathetic view. But back then, they were often seen as collaborators, and that stigma was intense. This helps explain why survivors like Lali, who held privileged positions in the camp, often stayed silent for decades. But with a reputation such as this, it makes historical sense for why Cilka received the 15 years hard labour sentence, even if we would be more sympathetic to her situation today. So then, how did Heather Morris arrive at the conclusion that Cilka was actually a sweet soul who could do no wrong? Well, I think it originates from Lali's descriptions of a mysterious young woman who sounds a bit like Heather Morris's Cilka. There was a girl, a very beautiful girl, a Jewish girl, the only girl in the whole camp who the SS allowed to keep her hair. I visited her in France, in Paris. She was living in the King George Hotel, very luxurious. She was married, she had a boyfriend, a very rich boyfriend. This is clearly the basis for the plot point that Cilka is the only person allowed to keep her hair. It's the same in the TV series, which is supposed to be more accurate. Lali didn't mention this woman's name, and when the interviewer asked him what her name was, he said he would tell her later, which is to say he'd forgotten. He also talks about travelling to visit her, but this trip sounds completely different to Gita's visit to Cilka. This young woman was living the high life in a luxurious Parisian hotel with a husband and a rich boyfriend who apparently both accepted this arrangement. Meanwhile, her stepson claims this was not what Cilka's life looked like at all. The one time she did visit France, it was not in a flight of luxury. So it seems we're dealing with three overlapping figures here. We have Cilka, the block leader, accused of cruelty and collaboration, for which the kindest explanation would be that she lost her mind in these extreme conditions and lashed out on others to survive. Then we have this mysterious, beautiful woman remembered by Lali who was allowed to keep her hair and then lived this extravagant life in Paris. Finally, we have Cilka, the heart of gold constructed by Heather Morris, who saved Lali's life and was the bravest person he ever knew. All three of them can't be the same person. Clearly something has gone very wrong here. How might this have happened? My theory is that Heather Morris built her initial view of Cilka from Lali's recollections of a beautiful young woman he admired but who suffered an unjust fate. The thing is, and I say this affectionately, I'm not sure how much Lali kept track of Gita's friends. Like many men born in 1916, I suspect, his wife's friends may have sort of blurred together a bit in his head. Heather describes how when Lali invited her to meet his friends, he would just sort of deposit her with the other women while he went off to chat with the men. So whether it was Lally misremembering or Heather Morris misunderstanding, or both, it seems that at some point two different women were conflated. And now we have this hybrid character of the beautiful Cilka who's always brave and always acting out of love. This fictionalization has some worrying consequences, especially in how the novel represents women's experiences and particularly how it handles very serious topics. And now we have reached that part of the video, so if you need to dip out, that's fine. The main point's been covered, but if you're feeling alright to stay, there is more here that's worth knowing. Now I've established who the real Cilka was, or rather wasn't, let's turn to how Heather Morris presents her fictional Cilka. Across all three novels, because yes, it's a trilogy, Cilka is constructed as an unwavering moral beacon. Every ambiguous or troubling thing about her is redirected to affirm her inner virtue. It's clear that Heather Morris approached the book with the belief that Cilka had a pure heart despite what she went through. But Heather Morris wasn't going to let a small thing like historical evidence get in the way of writing her uplifting story. So how does she reconcile the different Cilkas? Well, her primary technique is to claim that Cilka's more unpleasant moments were in fact simply a charade intended to hide some sort of secret kind action and to protect others from greater harm. Here are a few examples. Several survivors describe when Cilka put her own mother on the transport to the gas chambers. Witnesses consider this a shocking example of her lack of empathy. In Heather's version, however, the tone transforms into something else entirely. "Mama, no, don't get on the truck." The guards watch as Cilka's mother frees herself from her daughter, kisses her on both cheeks and on the lips, and runs her fingers through her hair. One last time. She then accepts the hands reaching down from the truck to help pull her up. Not only does fictional Cilka show great distress and grief at witnessing the fate of her mother, but she is also absolved of all blame. To the other characters observing the scene, it may look like Cilka is assisting in the death of her mother, but we as readers know that this is far from the case. Instead, her mother provides final emotional comforts to her daughter as she climbs onto the truck herself. Cilka is blameless, but her guilt remains. And this is one of the major themes of Cilka's journey. But what about the accusations of Cilka's violence and cruelty? Again, this is reframed in a positive light as simply a performance. "I've got them," she says to the SS officer, stepping in front of him as he's about to bring a stick down on the head of a nearby girl. Cilka gives her a hard shove, sending her sprawling face first into the snow. "Get up and join the others," she screams at the girl. The SS officer watches, nods to Cilka and walks away. He doesn't see Cilka bend down and hoist her arm under the girl's armpit, helping her to her feet. "Quickly, join the others," she says more gently. Cilka sees the SS officer turn back and screams at the woman, "Get inside now! I'm staying out here freezing because you're too slow and lazy to move." Gaunt faces stare at Cilka, looks of terror and helplessness. She longs to explain that if she screams at them, the SS won't come in. She does not lash out at the women in a cruel sense. Instead, she shouts and pushes them as protection from the greater evil of the guards. She follows her outbursts with offers of help, while her screams and shouts function to pacify the officers. If we remember, one survivor said she probably has more blood on her hands than anyone else. In the novel, fictional Cilka responds to this accusation. "You have as much blood on your hands as they do," she says in a shaking voice, pointing to the departing truck. The woman walks away, turning back, glaring at her. Cilka looks from her to the trucks as it rounds a building out of sight, to her hands. She tears at her gloves. Using her teeth, she frees her fingers, throws her gloves to the ground and drops beside them. Burying her hands in the snow, she grabs handfuls of it, rubbing each hand furiously, desperately, tears streaming down her face. The metaphor of the blood-stained hands is literalized, only for it to be immediately washed clean. Cilka isn't a monster here, but faultless, misunderstood, and traumatized by accusations that ignore her own suffering. The construction of a saint-like Cilka sets up Heather Morris's portrayal of the abuse she suffers. These scenes are coercive and painful, but framed within familiar tropes found in novels that deal with gendered violence. "You do like me, don't you?" Cilka forces her voice to sound loving. He doesn't see the tears she wipes from her eyes as she tells the biggest lie of her life. A lie that will allow her to stay alive. "Of course I do." Many of the crimes in the novel, like the selection process, are reconceptualized as assaults on the female body. He is choosing whether they will live or die, depending on whether or not their breasts are firm. This idea is not new to Heather Morris's writing. In The Tattooist, Lally considers tattooing women a defilement, but it comes back in full force in Cilka's journey. Cilka's beauty, the officer's malignant attention towards her, and their assertion that she is very lucky for it. These all serve to centre the trauma in her body. So why this approach? Maybe because, like many authors who have not lived through such atrocities, Heather Morris cannot fully grasp the industrial, impersonal horror, so instead she reframes it around something she can understand, the female suffering body, an innocent victim. David Dixon summarises the issue. The crimes are more comprehensible to Morris when they are enacted on Cilka's body. There were indeed rumours that the real Cilka had some sort of encounter with an officer, but the truth is unclear. One thing we know is that this is unlikely to be in the way that Heather Morris writes about it in her novels. Such a relationship, especially for someone in charge of a block for sick women, would have posed enormous health risks to the SS and violated racial purity laws. And yet, Heather Morris made it her mission to write her idea of what happened to Cilka. Unlike the Tattooist, where later editions were corrected after the criticism, Cilka's journey saw no such revisions. Heather Morris simply doubled down on her version of events. In fact, she even went as far as to give us historians a good telling off for criticising her. The shame is ours, not theirs. They lived for decades with the truth, the reality of what happened buried deep within. Time is up. It is time these crimes were called out for what they were. Crimes that were often denied as they were not official policy. To deny it happened is to stick your head in the sand. It is a long-established weapon of war and oppression. Why should they, one of the most vicious regimes the world has ever known, forswear this particular form of cruelty? Heather, your critics are not sticking their heads in the sand. We're not denying it happened. You're right that it has long gone unspoken. But that's not what's going on here. We're not saying it didn't happen. We're just saying it didn't happen in the way that you wrote it in your book. The Tattooist and Cilka's journey are being called out for completely misrepresenting the history and for twisting it to fit a particular narrative shape that is constantly seeking cheap ways to emotionally manipulate readers, to the extent that we have this whole situation where the family of a real survivor has been deeply upset by the novels. So let's put the fiction aside for a second and look at what the historical research shows. Despite what Heather Morris may assert, there is academic research into wartime abuse. While it's true that documentation is limited, that doesn't mean it didn't happen, only that it was rarely recorded. But what we do know complicates Heather Morris's portrayal. It was more opportunistic, or they were incidents designed to humiliate rather than prolonged, repeated encounters. This sort of thing existed within the camp system, but they did not involve Jewish women like Cilka. Heather Morris asserts that these women's experiences have been covered up by historians because we're too ashamed of it. I would argue that, in fact, the opposite is true. We today have a preoccupation with women suffering during war because we find it easier to mentally handle and conceptualise. One survivor wrote about what he terms the grey zone, or the liminal position of victims who in some way compromise or collaborate with oppressors in exchange for preferential treatment. He says we who haven't been in the position ourselves should not judge, and we should acknowledge it as a means of survival. Cilka's journey could have been an ideal opportunity to explore this grey zone, but instead we get hearts of gold Cilka who can do no wrong and who exists simply to be an exploited victim. It seems authors today, because Heather Morris is not alone in this, are not able to navigate these moral ambiguities and complexities unless it's filtered through something we find easier to understand, in this case the abuse of women. We seem to invent scenarios rather than confronting the actual matter at hand, the systematic extermination of whole groups of people. This is not a new thing. In fact, we can trace it back to the Second World War itself. In early 1943, a letter fabricating a story about 93 Warsaw maidens who chose to poison themselves instead of face abuse spread through the English-speaking press. Academics argue that this story possesses a higher cultural and emotional resonance than the unimaginable truth. And then, in the aftermath of the Second World War, there was often a presumption that it was a component of the atrocities. One survivor describes how she would have to explain this wasn't the case, and they merely wanted to kill her. And now, all these years later, we're making these same assumptions, and the result is that the truth about what happened keeps being obscured by this strange preoccupation because for some reason it's easier to exploit women's suffering than fully comprehend the atrocities. And then Heather Morris has the audacity to turn around and say she's raising awareness. She isn't raising awareness about anything. She's just contributing to these persistent misunderstandings. With the Tattooist, I could give her the benefit of the doubt and say it might have been Lali misremembering, and we have to give him a degree of respect to what he said. But Cilka's journey is almost entirely fabricated. Yes, it's based on the story of a real person, but it doesn't even seem like Heather Morris had the right woman half the time. Even if Cilka wasn't named, and if we had a new fictional protagonist, this wouldn't solve the problem, because the events of the book are so far away from the historical reality that it adds nothing apart from confusing readers and reinforcing old assumptions. Heather Morris may have wanted to give a voice to Cilka's tragic story as she understood it, and to raise awareness about a matter important to her, but in reality all she ended up doing was writing a book that has absolutely no resemblance to reality. Welcome to the end of the video club. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, let me know in the comments, and if you read the books, tell me what you thought about them. My favourite part is always hearing what you have to say, because no one needs to listen to my stupid thoughts for that long. This is more than enough, to be honest. I'm already tired of myself. So this is actually a trilogy of books, with the final title being Three Sisters. I will not be doing a deep dive into it because frankly I don't have too much to say, but my quick review is that this is actually the strongest of the three. Heather Morris's writing style improves so much by the time she gets to this one, and there is even one scene that almost brought a tear to my eye. No gimmicks, no shock value, just a sincere scene that packed a genuine emotional punch. And I think the reason this book succeeds is because Heather Morris worked closely with the sisters and their families as she was writing the book. So the story and the characterizations felt much fuller and well developed. It's just a pity we had to wade through the first two disasters before getting to a decent one. I think I am coming to the end of my Holocaust literature reviews for now, although I do think I have a Jojo Rabbit video brewing, so let me know if you'd be interested in that. And as always, a big thank you for watching, and follow me on all the other platforms if you're not already. I'm going to try and post a bit more about that, especially as I get more on the way of the PhD. So yeah, I'd be happy if you join me there. And yeah, have a lovely day, and a lovely week, and a lovely year, and a lovely life.